So one of the things that Kwame and myself like to do when we design for Fable's End and we think about the future of Fable's End is we like to look multiple years out into the future of the game. So rather than thinking about what the next thing is, we like to think about what the next 25 things are. Where will the game be in 5 years? What will the expansions look like in 5 years? And then we look back from that imaginary future and imagine what the game looks like building up to that point. And one of the things that exercise has taught us is how to go about expansions in our game and the release model for those expansions. And we've covered a little bit of it on the Discord. I've covered a little bit of it in the Kickstarter information page, but we haven't really gone over it in detail, like in a very comprehensive manner. So what I want to do with this video is I want to go over the expansion model that we have planned. This is different from us saying where we want to go in our expansions. We're going to touch on that. That's a separate video that we'll get to later. And I don't want to spoil anything because I think that where we're going to take the game is going to be really exciting and hopefully something novel that other games aren't going to be able to do in the same way that we will be able to do them, given that the subject matter of the game is stories, and stories are very versatile. So without further ado, let's get into the first three, or not the first three. Let's get into the three expansion models that we were exploring as we were thinking about the future of the game. I'm going to break each one down. I'm going to talk about the pros and cons of each one, and then we're going to talk about the one that we eventually settled on and how that expansion model will be applied to the future of the game. Now, this was the initial plan that we had for doing expansions way back when, 4 or 5 years ago, the first time that I met Kwame. This is kind of where I envisioned the game going. And the way that these expansions worked is that every time there is a new expansion, it's a new kingdom. And that new kingdom covers new story or a new world that it explores. And so the future of the game would look like, in 5 years, you'd have something like 10 or 15 new kingdoms that were added to the game. And there are advantages to this model and disadvantages to this model. One of the things that really worked well for us with this model was that the kingdoms and their theming would be incredibly easy to design. So if we were to do a kingdom about the Wizard of Oz, for example, it would be easy to create some sort of thematic through line for that whole kingdom because it just exists in a vacuum. And it enabled us to play in an area that was very specific. One of the other things that we could do with this model is it was great for, it had this weird effect of, if you've ever played the game Smash Up, which is a card game where you take two different factions and you blend them together to make your deck. And there are just tons and tons of factions in Smash Up. They have like vampires, and you have aliens, and you have cowboys, and you have this other stuff. And you could just mix and match all these decks together, hence the name Smash Up. The game in spirit would kind of be like that, where you would have all these different stories and you could start to smash them together to make new alliance kingdoms. One of the strengths of this model was that, let's say we did release something and it wasn't very popular. It'd be very easy to abandon that kingdom and to just move on to the next thing. So we wouldn't have to constantly be readdressing the same kingdom, and if something was a failure, we could just abandon it and let it go. Like, the subject matter and this kingdom mechanic wasn't popular, so let's just never make that again. Unfortunately, there are a lot of problems with this model. For as much freedom that it gave us from a creative standpoint to just kind of carte blanche, do whatever we want and create new kingdoms with new looks and new frames, it also created this problem where if you were a Scorpion player, you may not get new Scorpion cards for like a year or 2 years or 3 years. The Scorpion may fall into the back seat while, Wolf might get some supplements, or Raven might get a handful of cards every once in a while, but if there was a kingdom that you really liked, you wouldn't get anything to address that kingdom for a really long time. And we felt like that was ultimately not really the purpose here. It didn't feel like it was in line with what the game wanted to be, particularly because there's so much more for each kingdom to, so many more stories in each kingdom that we can expand upon. Even within the subject matter of something like Arabian Nights, there's still tons and tons of cards that we want to make. So it doesn't make sense for us to try to push new kingdoms all the time, but also supplementing the old ones, but then also having to supplement the new ones. And so it started to get a little bit out of hand as we were planning this. Another issue, which is something that we kind of will touch on, and it's not really a spoiler, but it kind of is a spoiler, is that were we to do alliance shields, well, a shield from 2 kingdoms, if we have 12 kingdoms, 14 kingdoms, and we wanted to do alliance shields for every conceivable alliance, all of a sudden the exponential amount of alliance shields grows to something like 100 different combinations if you have 12 shields, or 12 kingdoms rather. And that didn't seem feasible. That didn't seem like an acceptable amount for us. That just felt way too crazy. So that was a big strike against this model, this expansive model that we're talking about. Another big strike against this is that each kingdom currently has a zone that it can manipulate. And that zone, there are limited zones in the game. So currently there's 6, you could say 6 zones that can be manipulated. And what we were realizing is, as we were creating these new kingdoms, we were kind of having to either overlap them with existing kingdoms. So say you had a wolf-like kingdom that manipulated the sideline, but maybe did it in a different way, or it manipulated the sideline and the deck. And we realized that that doesn't work well in the long term, because it makes a novel kingdom feel like a retread of an old kingdom, because there are only so many zones to explore. Even if you put a new spin on those zones, it made more sense to have Wolf just have a really expansive repertoire of sideline manipulation, then Wolf have a limited amount of sideline manipulation, and then have some other kingdom also do sideline manipulation, and then have some other kingdom do sideline manipulation. And these things, over time, would feel like, oh, it's Wolf 2.0, it's Wolf 3.0. And when in reality, it probably should just be Wolf instead of being this other thing. So this model ultimately didn't feel like the right one, even though I had some solutions for these problems. One of them was, I really like the idea of having lineage, where every card in a new kingdom also had an alternate kingdom that it could be worked with, so it would continue the 4 core kingdoms. And so every card in the game would have a lineage to those 4 core kingdoms that was printed on the card. And this was creating a world where there were like inner kingdoms and outer kingdoms, and every kingdom was related to those inner kingdoms or the 4 core kingdoms. And I thought thematically that was a really cool solution, but mechanically it created a lot of problems, because it was like, oh, well, how does this work? Does it just count as a wolf card? Okay, well, if it just counts as a wolf card, then why isn't it just a wolf card? And so we had these exceptions for lineage cards, where a lineage card would count as a wolf card to be played, but it didn't provide a crest. And that got into some confusing visuals and confusing mechanics and rules that felt like it was overly complex. I did really like the idea of lineage, and we might revisit it in another way in the future, because I think it tells a cool story where you'd have something like the Wicked Witch of the West having scorpion lineage or wolf lineage, and that could create some really like interesting storytelling within the card, where you're like, well, why is that? How is this card related to this kingdom? It doesn't seem like it fits. And we could kind of create like a genealogy or descendancy from one story to the other story in a really interesting way. So again, it's not something that I'm totally abandoning as an idea, but it doesn't really work as well as some of the other models. Now the restrictive model, it's restrictive because what we're saying is rather than having an infinite number of kingdoms that go on until the end of time, we would just have 5 or 6 kingdoms that we would focus the game on, and that would be it. And the restrictive kingdom model would be similar to something like Magic, where we'd have 5 kingdoms, 5 colors, and every expansion that came out would distribute cards equally amongst all of those kingdoms. So you would have, if we did Peter Pan, Peter Pan would have cards in Wolf, in Scorpion, in Raven, and in Kraken, and in the other kingdoms. And this model allowed us to contain the issues that we would have experienced in the expansive model, where it's just endless kingdoms. We don't have to do something complex like lineage because, now every card just fits within those colors, or within those kingdoms. And this felt more in line with players' expectations as to how like factions work in TCGs, where everything kind of falls into a set number of factions. And what we're learning as we're moving forward is that as much as I love to tinker with the expectation and model of TCGs, if you push too far, if you go too far off the rails, you start to alienate players that have expectations, that or they have an expectation of a play experience in your game versus other games, and there is some dissonance there for players who are experienced or veteran TCG players who are looking for something analogous to what they're used to playing. And it's tricky because if you push too far in one direction, you risk alienating people. But if you play it too safe, then players are like, well, how is this different from the other game? So you have to identify yourself mechanically from other games in a unique way while retaining certain expectations that players might have of you. And this kind of model works well for that because we can have our 6 kingdoms or our 5 kingdoms, and that falls in line with what players are used to in other games that have like a 5-color system or different factions. The other advantage to this model is that from a mechanical point of view, it means that we have our 6 zones and we have a kingdom that focuses on those zones, and that's a constant throughout the lifespan of the game. So there's no mystery as to how all this stuff comes together. It's not like, what does this kingdom do again? I don't remember. It's like, no, Wolf is always sideline, Kraken's always deck, Raven's always losses, etc., etc., etc. And I think that expectation of predictability helps to ease the transition to more complex or nuanced mechanics in the future. If there's that foundation of familiarity that, it's a Wolf card, so it's going to mess with the sideline. But you might say like, well, hold on, it messes with the sideline in a new way because this is a new expansion card. So that's an advantage of doing a restricted style model where you have a set number of kingdoms that follow all of the zones in the game, because now those are just set for the rest of the game. There's no mixing and matching. There's no mystery. It's always this does this, this does this, this does this. Here's where this gets a little weird. A restricted model has some downsides. One of those downsides is that it creates a lot of thematic dissonance. If you, let's say that we did Peter Pan. Now, Peter Pan, in order for it to work as an expansion, we say we do the Peter Pan expansion. And we're using a restricted model where you have 5 or 6 kingdoms, and you take those cards and you try to put them in all those kingdoms. You might find that certain cards don't really work in other kingdoms. And so it can't be this model where we take a story and we distribute it evenly across all of our restricted kingdoms. Certain subject matter and certain stories weren't working in that model. And this is sort of the conceit of the restricted model, was that we were going to do this. We were going to take stories and just kind of spread them out across the kingdoms. It made for some really bizarre expansion where some expansions we would have to combine stories into expansions so that there would be an even distribution of cards in every kingdom, as opposed to like, well, every kingdom except Raven gets new cards, and you're like, well, why? And you're like, well, because this doesn't work. This story doesn't work in Raven, and that feels really strange. It doesn't work well for what we're trying to do specifically. It might work for other games, but we're not releasing our expansions in the same way that we would like in a game like Magic would, right? Where Magic would take a big world and then create, 400 cards in that world, and would touch on multiple stories, but like the world is the thing that's tying it all together, not necessarily the individual stories. And in Fable's End, individual stories are tying cards together rather than building one big world, because as we'll talk about in a minute, the world building starts to change as we adjust this model. The last model we're going to talk about is called a selective model. Now, it's similar to the restricted model. This model is the model that we are going to use moving forward. And Kwame and myself, have done a lot of work planning out how this is going to work. Now, initially, because we were doing the expansive model where it was just unlimited kingdoms, and we were doing a new kingdom for every set of stories, we did have a lot of stuff planned, and we had to kind of not unravel those plans, but just kind of figure out how to redistribute them. So in the selective model, we have 6 kingdoms now. And there is a very small possibility we introduce a 7th later on, but we have 6 kingdoms planned. We have our 4 core kingdoms plus 2 extra kingdoms that we're going to introduce later on. One of them will get introduced almost immediately, and then the other one we will try to follow up with an introduction either this year or in 2025. Each of the kingdoms will have its own zone that it cares about, and it will be very clean within those zones. The way that this is going to work is our expansion model will focus in 2 separate areas now. One area will be kingdom reinforcements, and what that is that that's a small expansion that has roughly 45 to 50 cards in a little tuck box that's specific to one kingdom. And all of those, every one of these tuck box expansions that we release will have all the cards are going to be themed together around some kind of story. We will get into that later. I've already kind of spoiled a little bit of that on the Discord with our expansion names, but the reinforcements are just singular stories for singular kingdoms. We also have premiere sets, and those premiere sets are different kinds of stories that will that are alliance expansions. What does that mean? Well, that means that, say you had a story like Wild West, right? That you wanted to do a Wild West expansion. That one would be something like a Wolf Scorpion alliance. And we would release it as a Wolf Scorpion alliance. And we would be releasing Wolf cards and Scorpion cards, and potentially cards that bridge the gap between those two. So it could be hybrid cards, it could be alliance shields, it could be chapters that share both a Scorpion and a Wolf crest that are required. It's a allegiance threshold would be Wolf and Scorpion. And that's how we're pretty sure that's how we're going to move forward. In fact, that is how we're going to move forward. And we already have a list of stories that are alliance stories. The biggest issue with this model is that in order to take all of the stories that we want to tell and fit them into 6 kingdoms, we have to sacrifice some of the setting in each of those kingdoms. It doesn't make sense for the Wolf Kingdom to be exclusively this birchwood forest that is full of Grimm's fairy tales, although that will continue to be part of Wolf as its identity and its location. But there are going to be some anachronistic things that we're going to introduce in the game, like we'll go to different timelines, and it will feel jarring if we just take them and drop them into Wolf with no explanation. Each of these kingdoms now, rather than being focused on one setting or one grouping of fairy tales, is going to have a philosophy that it follows. This is similar to Magic's Color Pie. And the way that this is going to work is that the kingdom will have like a motto or a saying or a phrase that they use with a set of traits that it embodies and a thing that it rewards. So this way we can take stories and we can say, all right, Wizard of Oz, if we take the themes of those stories, we can distribute them into multiple kingdoms or one kingdom, depending on what aligns with the themes of the story. What kingdom attributes align best with the themes of that story? And this is one of those things where it's a compromise that we've had to make in order to make the entire experience of expansions much more digestible for players. We think it's for the best, even though I'm a little sad that like the Wolf Kingdom will no longer just be the Birchwood. It will also be some other things that are not necessarily related setting-wise, but thematically they will have very similar attitudes. I hope this sheds some light on how we're moving forward with our expansions, and I hope that it will give you a little bit more insight into the way that we approach planning the game. And there's more to talk about the expansions, and I will do more videos that kind of break down the kingdoms in a more detailed way, particularly as they relate to the core set and as they relate to our first few expansions. The world building in the game will make some shifts as we move forward, but ultimately we want it to feel pretty consistent, which is one of the reasons why we shifted to this kind of model of mottos and themes rather than specific stories and places. Although that will still matter. But stay tuned, there's going to be more. And as always, give us a like, give us a subscription. Give us a subscription and join our Discord. We have a lot of stuff going on in our Discord, and it's really cool. The more people that we have in there, the more people we're talking about a lot of exciting stuff like multiplayer and Fable's End Online and some other things. But that's it. Bye.